Hello and welcome to this video on working with type in Photoshop Elements. Today we're going to be working through two examples. One is a simple concept word in which we'll sort of create an illustration of a word using just type. And then the second one is a logo type where we'll be kind of getting a little bit more advanced in our manipulation of type with type layers. So let's start with just a couple of guidelines about working with type to create a more interesting visual. First and foremost, I think, is think contrast. Big, small, thick, thin, black, white, black, red, serif, sans serif. Every place you go, think about to make it more interesting visually, you should have some of this and some of that, but the more you can play off one idea over the other, you're going to have a more dynamic looking visual. Use styles sparingly and quietly. So if you want to use a drop shadow, don't use a big sharp one, use more of a small diffuse one. And avoid at all costs the notion of kitchen sinking, where you have to have a bevel and a bus, drop shadow, a glow, an outline, a satin, 25 things on there that make the whole thing start looking junky and fuzzy. It's bad sort of aesthetically in most cases, but it's also bad technically, because pretty soon what you're going to be creating is a font that has to be rendered as a JPEG because it'll end up looking like a photograph, and that means slower and fuzzier on the web, harder to read, and just starts to eliminate all kinds of possibilities. So style should be used sparingly and quietly. One of the things that a little bit more of an intermediate or advanced technique, not that it's hard, it's just not one that's an obvious one, is since the days of Photoshop 4 or 5, type has been in what's called a vector format, an editable outline-based font that can be manipulated in lots of powerful ways. But there are still more effects and more ideas possible with a font after it's been rasterized. And what rasterized means is converted into a bitmap or just into dots. So one of the techniques I'm going to demonstrate for you is to have type both ways. Have a vector font and then also have a rasterized version of the same logo or word, and then you can do a little of both of what they're good at. And then keep your colors simple and similar in value. And by similar in value, I mean if you squint at it and you see yellow and you've got green, those two should be about the same shade of gray if you squint at them. You shouldn't have a really bright red and a really dull gray, and one will end up so dominant over the other that there won't be, the hierarchy will be so dramatic that you won't even see the other one, and it's especially true with type. So start by keeping your values similar, vary your colors a little bit, but I wouldn't go too crazy with contrasting color very dramatically. It can be overpowering very quickly. Let's pop into Elements now and take a look at a concept word and see how it was built and some options that you have that are very simple without getting too carried away with all of the capabilities of Photoshop. So in Elements we have a concept word that was built with only one font, and actually everything on here, believe it or not, is simply type forms in one form or another. So what we started off with is the word evil, and created that in a font called Chiller, built in, and added some other little elements, periods, commas, a hyphen, and just arranged those on the screen differently. So let's build this from scratch. I'll go to turn off these layers, and we'll add them back one at a time. Okay, so we're going to start with just typing a word, and let's just to make it even more challenging for us, we'll make it small at 12 point and Arial, and then we'll start the process of manipulating it. So if my concept word is, let's change this to fiend because it's really the same kind of concept, and now I'm going to start tinkering with fonts, but I got to have it large enough so I can see what I'm doing. I'll go to 48 point, and what font that I have or could find on the web that looks fiendish, and I'm going to go back down to my Chiller font. Lots of different concepts will pop to your mind after you look at these things, and some are kind of no-brainers and kind of simplistic. Let me show you dot matrix, for example. to some people that would say technology because it looks like, an old style printout of something. That's kind of simplistic, I think, in a rendering. A lot more that we could do with that, but that's a little simplistic. Let me do my chiller font, and we'll go. Once you have selected the font, it should kind of pop to your mind. Now that's kind of a mismatch. Well, maybe for some people it isn't, but the concept here of technology shouldn't sort of suggest a sort of medieval-looking, handwritten, hurriedly written, scrawled in blood kind of a font, but maybe for some of it. Let's change this to a little larger. Let's change it to my word here. I said fiend, and I'm going to make this larger to fill the space a little bit because fiend is big. There are some treatments where small and quiet would make a lot of sense, but I think fiend is big. I've done this before, so Elements is remembering my 260. But you might wonder how I get larger than 72. You just type it in the box. So let's say I wanted to go 300. And there's fiend. And the problem with it this large is that it tends to be so dominant that there's really nothing I can do elsewhere with it. But even if I wanted to do that, maybe a slight shrinking and a slight rotation might look interesting here, and move it to a corner. But I could also, there's nothing that says I have to have every word every letter in the word be together. So what I might do is create a second layer after I do a little deleting here. What if I delete D and then create a D? Usually you'll find if you just sort of click with the text tool, you can create that other layer. So I'll do a D, and then I've got two layers, FIEN and the D, and now maybe I'll move this something like that, or off to the side and down. Okay, so I'm just kind of tinkering around a little bit here, and maybe, of course, because this is fiendish, I need to have one be bloody. So I'll make it bloody looking. And there's my fiend. Just a subtle, I'm not going to go bright red. Blood isn't bright red anyway. Just a little bit subtle. And maybe I even want to make this rotated slightly the other direction. And so I'll click on it with just my arrow and rotate it slightly back and say OK. Now, just because I have full letter forms here, I could use punctuation marks, and the punctuation marks might be interesting. So what if I did a period? Now, I could get pretty corny with this and make this tracks of blood, but they'd be pretty uniform. I'll just duplicate this layer a few times. And pull them off. They're all going to be superimposed, and try to make it look as random as possible. But the fact that they're all exactly identical is going to create a problem for me as well. Let's see. So what I might want to do is modify or change the basic nature of that type form a little bit, just by doing something as simple as shrinking it down. Shrinking it down. And then rotating it so it looks a little different than the others. Yes, and then this one I might want to flatten a little bit. All this is possible in Elements. It's really kind of nice. In other versions of Photoshop, modifying the type is much more difficult than the simple kind of quick squish or stretch or rotate. It's kind of nice. So I could do something like that, and I could use other punctuation marks as well. So there's just sort of a simple manipulation of type. Now, what I can't do here is alter the basic character of an eye is still going to be an eye. I can't change, I can squish it and stretch it, but it's still going to be an eye. I can't change its form very much as a vector type, that is an outline type when it's represented as a T layer. But what I can do is simplify the layer, and that's I can do that in lots of different ways. But I'm going to click on the fiend, and I'm going to right click and choose Simplify Layer. Now, you want to do this sparingly and at the last possible moment, because once it's converted into dots, rasterized, it's no longer editable. I can't go in now and say, give me the eye and work on that. It's now just a pattern of dots. It's no longer characters. But once it's a pattern of dots, I can do all kinds of stuff with it. I can go in and erase little bits of it. I can erase that little speck down there. Or I can just kind of wash over it with or pull it. One of the kind of nice tools, if I was going to do something like this, might be the smudge tool. I can't smudge the D. Let's illustrate that. I'll go to the D layer here. I've got quite a few layers, so finding it will be a second. So I'll find the D, and I'll try the smudge tool with the D, and it's going to yell at me. Must be simplified. Well, gosh, oh, that's okay. I've simplified some layers over here. Let's go to the fiend layer, and I'll smudge. And smudge that down and smudge it so it starts to look wispier here, and smudge it here and smudge it there. So I can do all kinds of sort of hand drawing effects once that layer is simplified. Again, it's not editable as characters anymore, but it is now dots, and I can do lots more with it. I can also use a lot of other painterly effects with type once it's simplified, and I might do something like use a watercolor brush here, the brush tool, and make it partly opaque, that is less than 100%. Give myself kind of a nice medium-sized to small brush, and since I've got the blood color already there, I can just carefully go in and paint, maybe add some. Now I'm not seeing that so well, so I'll make this a little brighter just to illustrate an idea. I can go on to my and add some shadows of blood on here, and add some outlines, or really almost anything is possible. So this is probably technically not within the rules of our assignment, because it said don't modify the typeforms, and I'm doing that. But I just wanted to give you some ideas of what can happen once you simplify a layer. You have access to all of the painterly tools. We can also apply layer styles to any layer, including layers that have type or just simplified type or any kind of image. I have my effects palette hidden here just so that we can focus on layers temporarily, but I want to turn that on. I'll click on its arrow, and I can see my effects. And the second button over is my layer effects or layer styles button. And then the sort of basic categories are shown here, but you can also access them under the menu, which you might find more convenient than the preview. So let's try just a simple drop shadow. And it's going to give us a preview of the options that we have available, and then I'll click on apply. And we can see a drop shadow now. And this is an example of a style that I think is just a little bit too much, so we might want to try to find one that's a little bit more subtle and try it. I think that's a little bit better for the effect that I'm going. Let's try the sort of kitchen sink example. Layers are cumulative, effects are cumulative, so if I keep going with this stuff, I can do a glass button effect with a drop shadow, and I can do a outer glow effect with a drop shadow. And you can start getting these are fun. Oh gosh, my drop shadow isn't nearly big enough now. These are fun, but they're going to get in the way of, I don't know if I can get that to even show up here with a, there it is. You can kind of see it on the outside there. These are lots of fun, but pretty soon they're going to get to be pretty annoying. Let's do that one. So lots and lots of stuff are possible, but they start taking away from the sort of subtlety of the design, and unless you're really trying to go wild with something, I would tend to try to keep those as quiet as possible. So just some basics of working with type to review. Use a font that pops out for this assignment with a concept. You can rasterize the layer, simplify the layer, and then you can apply painterly effects, and then you also have the option of applying layer styles. Let's go on now and create a new file and build a logo type. And for a logo type, you can probably keep your file dimensions relatively modest. I'll go 600. I can always make them smaller later. I'll go 600 by 300 here. Let's just illustrate the idea of logo types by creating a alternative folio web logo type. And we'll kind of do this in parts. We'll start with the word folio, and we'll do that in Arial. Now you're going to see a little bit of jaggedness here unless you're working at 100% at all times. Anything less than that typically will give you just a little bit of a poor rendering of the font. That's pretty small for what I want to go, so I think I'll go to about 72. And for now I won't apply any effects. I'll keep this kind of modest. But for contrast, I have lowercase sans serif. So maybe that for the web part I might want this to be, oh, it's also red. I might also, for my web part, I might want to go with a serif font. And so let's choose something that's a little bit old school, like a Bookman old style. And I'll make this all caps. Now, web doesn't show up very well in red on red, so let's do blue. And I'll move that up. Now that's pretty simple, and in fact maybe a little too simple. For one thing, again, thinking like my grid, if you haven't discovered guides, I'm going to turn on the grid, and you can also use guides as well, guide presets, and customize those if you wish, but I'll just use the grid. I'm going to put the web just slightly down so that it's on that grid line with Folio Web, and then you can kind of see that it's slightly shorter than the top of the I, dot of the I, and the top of the F. So I'm just going to stretch that up a little bit and move it back down, stretch it up. It's just moving for me a little bit, and there we go. Yeah, too much. It's snapping to the grid, so I need to make sure I say don't do that. Don't snap to the grid. And pull it up a little bit. Pretty good. Okay. Now, by the way, I don't like this at all, but just for sake of illustration, I'm going to keep going with it. I'm going to try a different font here for the web part. Bodani seems to be a little too much, so I think I might go back and try a version of Garamond if I have one available here. And I think that's a lot nicer. Contrast, old and new, modern, and not quite so modern. Now, I don't have to have all uppercase. Maybe I'd like to try the E and the B as lowercase. So I'm not all that happy with the spacing between the E and the B. Unfortunately, Elements doesn't have a lot to help me with there unless I wanted to make those as separate layers. And I'm just going to do that by cutting and then pasting. The full version of Photoshop has some additional options for me here. And now I'll move the E and the B back up. So the full version of Photoshop has some additional typographic controls, but I wanted to tuck the E and the B under the W slightly tighter. It's called kerning, and the W, especially the W, capital A, a few other letters, are particularly problematic because their diagonal shapes causes us to need to kind of manually visually align the letters a little bit. Now, having done that, I think that the letter forms of Folio Web now are kind of fat. So I might want to skinny that down, but just in the interest of time, I'm not going to go too hog wild with this. Now, I think I am going to try layer style, and I'm going to try a layer style on the W, and I'm going to do a drop shadow. And again, just trying to keep it a little subtle and apply it. Now, the grid is distracting me a little bit, so I'm just going to go turn it off. I kind of see how that's coming, and I like that. Elements is pretty straightforward. There aren't too many different styles to choose from, so if I just sort of remember what I did, I'm just going to go in and click on do that again on the E and the B part. However, if I had applied a series of styles, there is a function that allows me, if I right click on the layer, to copy the layer style. Now remember, layer styles are cumulative, so if I've applied 6 or 7 effects, I hope you don't, then I can copy those and paste those onto another layer. So I'm not going to need to do that. This is pretty simple. Now I may do the exact same thing with Folio Web. That is the same layer style. And just to illustrate, I'll grab the one from the W. I'll choose copy, and then I'll choose paste. and I get my drop shadow there. Now, kind of interestingly enough, I think that when I did that, it looks like the kerning over here is also kind of an issue. The O and the W, I could kind of nudge that together a little bit, and I think I will. Just a little teeny bit. Now, you might even try some things like overlapping. Now, that's kind of underlapping. I want Folio Web to be in front, so I'll just do that. You might try overlapping. You don't have the ability in Elements to kind of intermingle and edit the typeforms themselves, but you might play around with that concept as well if you rasterize the type, as we talked about earlier. Now, this is kind of a traditional drop shadow. I might want to create a little three-dimensional look to the word Folio Web here, Folio. And what I'm going to do there is I'm going to try a bevel and emboss, and that's going to give me a rounded look depending on which version I choose. And so I think I'm going to try maybe this one. A little bit too much. I think I'll try this one instead. That's a little better for what I'm interested in. Okay, so I'm kind of working there. I might want to add another element or two. The web part for me looks now a little flat, kind of back there, and that's maybe good, maybe bad. But let's try something a little different here. I'm going to make a copy of the word folio, copy that layer. And on my copy, I'm going to simplify that layer. So now what I have is an exact duplicate, sort of, but what I have is a duplicate that's just the dots. That is, it doesn't contain editable letter forms like this one does. And you can see that in my type layer. I have a layer that has a T that says folio, but then you can actually see the characters in my folio web copy layer. That's indicating that it's actually simplified and no longer an editable type form. But that gives me all kinds of other possibilities. If I go to the image menu and choose transform and choose perspective, then I can pull these corners out. Now it looks rough now, but when I click the green arrow, it'll be fine. Now that's not what I want to do, as you can imagine. I'm going to flip that around. So what I'm going to now do is say rotate and say flip vertical. Now that's starting to kind of look like a little bit of a drop shadow, maybe, but let me squish it in. Better. And now I'm going to apply a filter, and the filter is one that you probably wouldn't have thought of using very much, but blur. Blur is actually one of the most commonly used filters to correct photographs, and that's sort of paradoxical. Most people want their picture sharpened, but blur is a very powerful tool in working with images. And just to not linger on this too long, that's probably pretty close. I think I want to blur it a little bit more, and maybe about like that. About 3.4. Okay. Now, that kind of gives me a mirror look, but that's not really how shadows work in the real world. That's like it's a very evenly applied shadow on all of the forms there. That's not how it would really look. So what I'm going to do next is I'm going to say enhance, and I'm going to choose color, enhance, adjust color, and I'm going to choose adjust hue and saturation. Lots of options here, but this is one of my favorites, and I'm just going to say now decrease the saturation. And what that means is take color out. Now I'm going to leave a little bit in, and while I'm here I'm also going to make this a little lighter. Okay, so that's really starting to look a little wispy. But the way that this drop shadow would really work if it was real, I'm going to squish it in a little bit more, I think, is that it would be more fuzzy further away. Can I selectively blur? And yeah, you want to use the blur tool from the smudge. And now this acts kind of like a paintbrush. So I'm going to increase the brush size just because I'm impatient. And again, because I'm impatient, I'll leave the strength high, 73%. That's probably too high. But now if I just move over the letters, they'll start getting selectively blurrier. And again, as I said, I'm kind of impatient here, so I'm going to increase the strength all the way and really selectively, and I'm just wiggling back and forth with that tool going, selectively blur this out. I think it's still a little too dark, and I could even blur outwards, maybe even use the smudge tool with a very large brush, again in the 30-40 inches, and keep the strength down on the smudge. It's a very powerful tool, and smudge out a little bit just to kind of distort the characters a little bit, and go back to my blur tool, and working too fast here to get a really good result, but now 100% strength, that's all good, and just keep working at it. Now, almost all the paint tools in Photoshop have the ability to work with a pressure setting. So I can even use the eraser now, standard eraser, with a paintbrush style, a brush style, and instead of having it work at 100% opacity, which would just erase, I can have it work at less than 100%, maybe even 10%. And now it'll erase a little bit, not all the way. And again, it takes sort of patience to see it kind of emerging, and patience is something that's difficult for any of us to have, so I'll crank it up a little bit. Let's go 50%. And I'm erasing. Now that's obviously too much, but I'll undo that, and I'll go to like 25%. And erase more out and less in, and with some patience and trying a few times, I can kind of get a pretty good drop shadow effect going there, just a little wispy, and going back and forth between blur, and you'll find that you can get pretty much any effect you want. So what I'm doing here is trying to illustrate what becomes possible once you have simplified a layer. You can apply painterly effects and create any kind of look that you want. And of course, I'm not going to affect the folio web part because it's in a different layer altogether and protected. So you could keep going on this, add other kinds of elements, graphics, shapes, even parts of images that you find, modify with layer settings. But the basic idea is looking for contrast between thick and thin, round and square, old and new, red and blue in this case, anything that you want to try to produce a transformation of the layers, transformation of the letter forms that still relate to each other somehow. Now, if I was going to be very critical of this logo type, for me, I'd say, how do the two font families I've chosen, Garamond and Arial, relate to the concept of folio web, whatever that concept is? And my answer has to be they don't very well. So I probably want to be a little bit mindful of the fonts not really relating. I mean, I can produce a really cool logo sooner or later that has nothing at all to do with the enterprise that I'm working with. One last thing. Now that I've gotten this far, and I'm not happy with this, but pretend I was, I could go to my original folio web layer and also simplify it. And I just want to illustrate one idea here. Since this layer is now simplified, a cool thing that'll happen, I'm still with the blur tool. Let me go back to the eraser. I'm not going to be very careful with this, but I just want to show you some things that are possible. I'm going to set my eraser small with a block mode, and even I'll do pencil mode here. And if you were very careful, and I'm not going to be, you could, and that's not showing up, so let's make it a little larger. I'll zoom in, and what I want to sort of illustrate is that you can carve the letter forms. That's my problem, is my opacity. Let's go back to 100% and carve the letters. Now, don't like that at all, but let's go back to 1%, 1 pixel. Now, zooming in, you're not going to see, this is not going to look very nice, and I'm going to do this too hurriedly. And I'm going to illustrate this as a better idea here in a second. But let me zoom out, and you can actually go in and hand create a font. Now, because that really turned out terrible, what I want to do is illustrate this idea by just doing something silly, like replacing, by erasing the, and let me get block mode here. I'm going to erase the I in folio web. Now with that gone, I'm going to take my same color blue and I'm going to create a little ellipse, but I'm going to hold the Shift key down to make it a perfect circle. Okay, so I have a layer that's a little ellipse, and I bet you can see where this is going. I'm going to replace that up there, and let's zoom in and see what's going on. Because it's a shape, any layer, I can apply the same kind of layer style that I did. So I'll go back to Folio, the word Folio that has a layer style, copy it, and find my shape 1, which is my little speck, and paste that on there. And zoom out. So I can mix and match elements here, and shapes and images and painterly versus vector, and have a pretty interesting logo building over a period of time. So again, the critical point in building a logo type, I think, is contrast, to make visual interest between the various parts of the logo. Now, just to illustrate that point, one last bit. My font here is Folio, is an Arial regular 72-point blue. So I'll type the word Folio Web. Okay, that's not a logo type. What that is a word or characters. If you take that and you apply a layer style, I still have one copied, so I'll paste it. That's not a logo type. That's a word. It's boring. It's got nothing going for it at all. So let's make the W all caps. Guess what? Still not a logo type. You've seen some fairly simple ones in the world, but it really, the more contrast, the more visual interest, and especially the more you can tie those contrasting elements back to the concept that the logo represents, you'll have a much more successful logo type. I hope you have a chance to go out to the web and find some of those that amazing collection of logos that we've posted. Really just the average designer gets about $500 to produce a logo type that may exist in the industry for 50 years in the case of some of the famous logo types. But they can be really creative and say an awful lot about an organization with just a few quick letters. So hope you have a little bit of fun with this problem. Think contrast, and try to keep your efforts modest. Don't go crazy with the kitchen sink, but think about subtle contrast between letter forms within the logo type.